and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about Euphemia DeRoss.
One day we will be remembered.
Euphemia. I already like her. We get an awful lot of Elizabeths, Isabellas, Annes, Marys, and Margarets. It's nice every once in a while when you get a Euphemia, or a Jacquetta, or an Ermengarde. This is one of those episodes with Euphemia DeRoss. Euphemia was born in 1329. Her father was an earl named Hugh, and her mother was Margaret. We don't have much on her childhood, but what we do know is that she was widowed at the age of 17, meaning that at some point before that, she had been married. How long? I have no idea. But in 1346, Euphemia was a 17-year-old widow of an earl, but they had no children. She likely had dower lands to support her in the event of her husband's death, because she stayed single for the next 9 years. She was single and not ready to mingle. The only way she could have decided that for herself is if she had enough money to live on, or if she became a nun. Euphemia changed her mind, though, at the age of 26, agreeing to marry the nearly 40-year-old Robert Stuart. Robert was the heir of his still childless uncle. She gained, at the age of 26, a husband and 10 to 13 stepchildren, some of whom she was closer in age to than her husband. There were some problems getting this marriage through. It wasn't smooth. The first problem, over a decade before, possibly before she was even married the first time, her first husband had been the co-regent of Scotland. The other co-regent? The man she wanted to marry second. This was more of a PR problem. People talked, and what they were talking about was that her first and second husbands were essentially former business partners. But there was also a problem with people who were too closely related, as usual. It's time to put something in the category of, they knew this in the 14th century. The bride and groom were fourth cousins, better than first cousins. I don't think we know how they are fourth cousins. We just know that the paperwork says that they are. And let's be honest, do you know who your fourth cousin is? That will be someone you share a great-great-great-grandparent with. Do you know who your great-great-great-grandparents were? Everyone has 32. Well, they have 32 as long as related people weren't marrying each other. In this time period, there were some duplicates. But most people can't name their 32 great-great-great-grandparents. I'm pretty into family trees, if you can't tell. And I do know some of mine, 30 of them to be exact. I'm only missing 2. To put that in perspective, these are men and women who were alive in the mid-1800s. Queen Victoria was still the young Queen of England. Don't worry, I'm not going to name them all. You are welcome. But I am partial to my great-great-great-grandmother, Anakin. She was French, and I have to assume she didn't like sand.
I don't like sand.
Back to Scotland. That wasn't the biggest problem, though. In addition to the bride being the groom's fourth cousin, the groom was just second cousins of the bride's first husband, meaning her 2 husbands shared a great-grandparent. Their parents were cousins, so they were keeping it all in the family, because a second cousin is much closer. But the Pope said it was totally fine. God forgives you. The couple married and started a family. David was born in 1357. Walter, born in 1360. Elizabeth, born in 1360. And Egidia, born in 1370. I don't know if I'm saying Egidia right. I have seen it pronounced as Egidiah, but that doesn't seem like the Scottish pronunciation. But I'm open to corrections. If you know how to pronounce this name, spelled Egidia, I'm all ears. And if you didn't catch it, those dates don't sound completely accurate with 57, 60, 60, and 70, but you never know. There could have been births close together or other babies that died young. Euphemia's husband was a prolific baby maker. He had 10 to 13 children from his first marriage, and at least 12 illegitimate children by other women. And now 4 more with his second wife. If you're keeping count, that's 26 to 29 children. During the start of Robert's second family, one of his sons from his first marriage, Walter, died at the age of 24. Euphemia's son Walter was about 2 years old when his half-brother, also named Walter, died. That's when Euphemia got a new job. Her husband's uncle died unexpectedly at the age of 46. The king had died with no children, and his heir was his 55-year-old nephew, Euphemia's husband. Because the king was childless, they kind of saw this coming, but the sudden death of the king made it a reality. The House of Bruce had only lasted 2 generations, from Robert the Bruce to his son David. The king is dead. Long live the king. The new king was a Stuart. His father was a Stuart, but his mother had been Marjorie Bruce, the oldest daughter of Robert the Bruce. She has her own episode. So the Stuart line is descended on the paternal line by the Stuarts, but on the maternal line, they were still Bruces. The new king was King Robert II, and Euphemia was the Queen of Scots at the age of 42. The old king wasn't buried where he had wanted to be. He was just buried at the closest option because the new king, his nephew, didn't really care for his uncle and didn't really care where he wanted to be interred. This was the example that Robert's children had, not only in their formative years, but also for some of them into their adulthood. So remember the new king's 26 to 29 children? He worked hard to get his legitimate children power. Specifically, his 4 oldest sons. Know your limits, folks. Maybe 29 is a few children too many. But if they were all powerful, they wouldn't have anything to fight about. Or they would have more to fight about and more resources with which to wage war. King Robert made his oldest son with Euphemia the Earl of Strathern, the same day he became king. Or probably more accurately, Queen Euphemia probably did. The king was aging and needed help from his wife. Their oldest son was named David, and he was about 14 years old. Walter, still only about 10, did not receive an earldom, the only one of his legitimate brothers not to be made an earl. In 1384, King Robert, aged 68, was sidelined, and his eldest son and heir took over. King Robert II was in his retirement era, and it was a somewhat forced retirement. King Robert had 6 sons. His oldest son was named John. He was the 47-year-old heir apparent, the Earl of Carrick, and the obvious regent as the next king. Until, later that same year, he had a horseback riding accident and was no longer able to rule either. His wife, Annabella, tried to bridge that gap for him. The king's second son was Walter, but he had died 2 decades before when he was just 24. So he didn't have time to become part of the family drama. The king's third son was named Robert. Robert was the 44-year-old Earl of Fife, and his brother's spare since the death of his other brother 20 years earlier. He wanted to be king, and his brother's horseback riding accident made that seem like a possibility. The king's fourth son was named Alexander. Alexander was the 41-year-old Earl of Buchan. He was powerful in the north. He was also problematic. He is one of the main reasons his father needed a regency. His father couldn't control Alexander. The king's fifth son was named David. He was the 27-year-old Earl of Strathern. He didn't get along great with his brother Alexander, the problem of the north, but most of them didn't get along with Alexander. He was problematic. The king's sixth and final son was named Walter. I know what you're thinking. Wait, does Walter have an older brother named Walter? He did. When Big Walter was 22, his father and stepmother had a baby and named him Walter also. Then, 2 years later, Big Walter died, and Little Walter was the last Walter standing. Coincidence? Yes, it was. Little Walter was his father's youngest son, so he was the 24-year-old Earl of Nothing. Remember John Lackland? Well, this is Walter Lackland, the only non-Earl out of all of his brothers who were all fighting. For now, Little Walter was out of the drama. But just for now, he will definitely get into it later. Because have you heard of his brothers? They were bad influences. This is how the end of Euphemia's life went. Her husband gained a regent, and her 2 oldest stepsons were fighting over who that regent should be. Her other stepson and her oldest son were fighting over land, and their baby was little Walter Lackland. Euphemia died in 1386 at the age of about 57. She was survived by her 70-year-old husband and her children, David, Walter, Elizabeth, and Egidia. Again, if you know how to pronounce that, help a girl out. And that is where we will leave it for now. What did you think about EuphemiaDeRoss? We don't know much about her, unfortunately. Some people thought she was a bit of a gold digger going after the likely future king, but I think she was in love. And she became Queen of Scots and had 4 children with a man that she chose, even if he did seem a little petty. I think that's sweet. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.